The median rent of a 3-bedroom apartment in Cambridge today is $3,425. I'm Christopher Schmidt, and this is Renters Matter. Renters Matter is a show where we talk about all things renter, and this week there's one thing that's on the mind of so many people who are looking at tenants and renters and displacement and everything in that space in the Boston housing market, and that is rent control. Rent control and tenant protections. Yesterday at the State House, a rally led by Mike Conley and Nika Elgardo, I'm bad at names, I'm sorry, several State House representatives to push for lifting the ban on rent control as well as pushing for other tenant protections was held. And this was like many rallies at the State House, was attended by people who are affected by these problems. There were speakers from the State House politicians who are pushing for these things from the city level or from the state level, as well as people who are affected by high prices, rising rents, and who've seen the changes and the impact of construction in our city. And overall, what we found is that, of course, people are losing their homes. This is not in question. There are people who are losing their homes as the result of rising prices in Boston. No one disputes this. With the overall desirability of Boston and Cambridge and all the cities in this metro having gone up, and the number of homes we have built not going up to match in any way, shape, or form, people are losing their homes. And in many cases, especially in Boston, what you are seeing is that the people who are losing their homes are the people who are least able to deal with that. You're talking about seniors who are on fixed incomes. You're talking about people who have lived in the same place for many years, seeing significant increases in rent. You're talking about people who are oftentimes in buildings with that are dilapidated and are purchased by investors to be fixed up and replaced, and as a result they're looking to raise rents. The stories from City Life Vita Urbana that were told at the rally yesterday for rent control and tenant protections were painful to hear, as they always are. City Life is an organization in Boston that fights to protect people who are being evicted, who are fighting to keep their homes, who are fighting to get landlords to take care of properties and other things like that. They act as an organizing force to help people realize their legal rights and get their legal protections enforced. At the same time, we heard stories from the Chelsea City Council president, or council president, I don't know exactly, who came and spoke and mentioned that in Chelsea homelessness has doubled, and they've seen school children who are forced to move from shelter to shelter, children who are forced to lose access to their schooling as they're forced to move away from where they were in school and be in someplace else. And I don't think that there's anybody in the world who looks at this situation and says, yes, I really want children to be dealing with being homeless. I really want children to be forced into shelters. Nobody looks at that and says that. Nobody wants homelessness. Nobody wants people living on the street. The question, though, is what do you do about it? And this is one area where there's a lot of people who work in different aspects of the housing fight that feel differently. Many people look and say, homeowners don't have to pay increased prices on their homes as they live in them. Why should renters have to face increased prices on their rent? Or why should rent go up at more than the cost of something, some percentage of whatever? On the other hand, you have people who point out that when you have rent control, you're not able to help people who aren't in homes and protect people who aren't in homes. That you have people who, when you have migrants or immigrants to a community, are not able to get homes because rent-controlled units stay in people's hands for longer. Obviously, this is part of the point, but it means that you are losing some of that access, some of the units that would be available for people. And you've got people who say, well, the only homes that are being built are high-end homes. The only thing that is being created is, homes that aren't affordable to people on the low end, and we're not helping the people who need it most, the people who are at most risk of being homeless. And the reality is that all of these people are right. Like every single person is right. When you say that rent control keeps tenants in their units longer, and there aren't going to be homes for everybody who would need them, that's true. If you don't create more homes, people won't have them. On the other hand, when you say, well, you can't just have expensive units be built and it will suddenly help the poorest of the poor, that's actually true too. When you are people who are living below the bottom of the market prices in any given area, like they're not able to be helped by changing, rents or other things, building new units. That's not necessarily going to help them, certainly not help them quickly, because homes aren't built quickly. You can't add enough homes this year to supply the massive demand that has been built up over 30, 50, 75 years of not building enough homes for people. And so what we're facing here is a massive crisis in supply. A massive crisis in supply driven largely by control over what is being built coming from people who already have homes, people who already have stable living situations, and pushing back on the idea that there should be more supply. At the same time, you have a problem where, if you were to suddenly add new supply, it's not going to help people at the lowest end. So how do you balance all of these concerns? How do you balance these issues? Is rent control a good idea? Is supply the only solution? And the answer to both of these things is everything is important. We can't just build new homes and expect that to help people who are on the verge of losing their home now. The reality is that if you cannot build enough homes in the next 5 years to satisfy enough demand, that rents will suddenly stop everywhere. That's not going to happen. You just can't build enough homes to do that. So you've got to find some other solutions to do that. We're in a transition period now where increase in being in an urban area and the recovery of Boston and Cambridge as desirable places to live after the 1980s and the 1990s, and being, cities being now someplace that people want to be again, to live in walkable areas, and the massive number of technology and knowledge jobs that have come to our cities, you've got to find some way to transition from your current situation, which is far too expensive for far too many people, where significant chunks of Boston residents are paying more than 50% of their income on rent, and you need to find a way to transition that into a place where that is less true. And some of this may be that and not some of this, there will need to be new supply of public or subsidized housing in order to provide for some people. There are homeless people in the city of Boston and the city of Cambridge right now who do not have any money to pay, no matter what the rent is. They don't have the money for that. They need more support than that. You're going to have to build homes for people who cannot pay anything. You're going to have to do that. At the same time, you're going to have to find a way to hopefully keep people in their homes. Now, one of the big issues that we hear over and over again from the people who are most impacted by rent increases is massive rent increases all at once, right? There was a state rep who who spoke at the State House yesterday, and he said, I moved to Boston, and I was here for 1 year, and I talked to the landlord, and I said, hey, is the rent going to be okay? I've got this new, unit that I'm coming into, am I going to be able to stay here next year? He said, oh, yeah, no problem, you paid, and you're in for a while. Of course, next year, his rent was raised 45% because there is no limit to the amount that rent can be raised. The only thing they need to do is give you 30 days notice and say, hey, we're raising the rent. And while you can fight that, and while you can push back on that, and while City Life does help tenants push back on that, the reality is that if someone wants to raise the rent on your unit, eventually they will be able to. You may be able to fight for a certain time, you may be able to push back, but you will, at some point, have to find a way to pay that rent or find a new home. And for many people, finding a new home requires money that they do not have. We talked about this a little bit last week, that finding a new rental apartment means that you're paying probably 4 times the amount of rent that you're going to have to pay in order to take that apartment and have it and get a hold of it. And if you don't have money to pay rent, the idea that you would have a lot of money to move is obviously not going to work. And this is how homelessness happens. This is how a $100 a month rent increase can turn someone from being housed to not housed. And we've got to find ways to fix that. Because if we can keep people in their homes, it is much less expensive for us. We can take care of people and save money at the same time. We've got to find ways to do that. At the same time, you can't just say the rent in a place should never ever change. You can't. You can't do that because at some point the water heater is going to need to get replaced. At some point, the property taxes are going to go up. At some point, the costs of maintaining the building exceed the cost that you're getting from rent. And so rent control has issues, especially in the areas of maintenance, where in many cases what we saw in Cambridge is that at the end of rent control, you saw a massive number of people displaced as rents were raised significantly from where they had been in some cases for 25 years. But at the same time, what you saw was that many of those properties that had been under rent control were in a situation where they were under-maintained, where they were being, left by landlords to rot effectively because they saw no need or no value for them in maintaining them. And we heard those stories yesterday at the State House too. Heard of landlords punching holes in walls or taking the stove out of someone's unit or pulling out electrical wires in order to get someone to leave. And frankly, these stories are all too common. They're the types of things that, again, City Life Vida Urbana deals with all the time. They're the types of things that tenant organizing organizations deal with all the time, where landlords leave buildings, even without rent control, to rot because they just don't see the value. If I can't raise the rent, if I can't make more money from this property, why do I bother to maintain it? And while there are standards set for what a habitable unit has to be, the reality is that enforcing these things, especially for low-income people who don't have access to legal resources, is almost impossible. And the reality is, again, that we need more homes. We need more homes that are available to people who have no income. We need more homes that are available to people who have middle incomes. And one of the ways that we also need more homes is that we need more homes that are available to people with high incomes. So when those people come in here working at high-end tech jobs, instead of taking more affordable homes from people who would otherwise take them, that they're not bidding up the prices on more affordable units, that they're not bidding up on the prices on older units, that they're not taking those out of the stock, and that they're trading up. What happens when you build a new luxury or market rate building is that a significant number of people from the community who are currently in more affordable homes will trade up to those new units. In many cases, that number is up to a third. A third of new units in a market rate building are often taken by people who are already in the community, moving up and filtering up to a higher end unit. And so those units offer value immediately to people who are in lower cost, lower income brackets. They offer value almost immediately to people who are in lower income brackets. And that's an important part too. We have to say yes to all of these things because we are in a housing crisis or a housing emergency. We have rising homelessness. We have rising prices. We have rising rates of displacement. And a lot of this is more true in Boston than in Cambridge. Cambridge has a kind of, people have often said that Cambridge finished gentrifying back in 2005. Now it's where the gentrifiers come from. And while that's not universally true, it is true that a significant chunk of Cambridge's population is already in subsidized low-income housing that is effectively rent-controlled. 15% of Cambridge's units are rent-controlled. We're seeing a situation where a lot of the remaining people are not at the lowest income brackets because those lowest income brackets, there are no homes. As we've talked about, when a one-bedroom apartment costs $2,300 a month, there's not going to be a lot of people who are making $50,000 a year who are going to live in them in Cambridge. And that's not as true in Boston or in other towns in the area, and so there are different aspects of the market here. But what we're seeing is that you can't help everybody just by building more supply. You have to do all of these things. And it's not just rent control, although rent control has been the watchword of the day with the rally at the State House yesterday and Bernie Sanders tweeting about it today and some YouTuber who I've never heard of talking about protect landlords. The reality is that rent control is only one piece of that. There's a whole series of tenant protections that you need to look at. You need to look at taking away the ability for a tenant to be evicted for no reason at all, which is currently the case. You need to look at when a unit is going to be sold, being able to have an option to buy that unit. You need to look at changing how units are converted to condos. You need to look at all of these things. And you need to look not at rent control as it was back in, the 90s here, or, as it is in New York where prices stay the same forever, but instead something that matches more with what it costs to maintain housing, because maintaining housing does cost money. While many landlords will try to avoid paying that money, managing housing does cost money, and you have to provide for that. Otherwise, the housing isn't maintained. Otherwise, there is no motivation for people to be good landlords, and they will find ways to not be good landlords in order to not be landlords. So one of the people who's running for city council, Jeevan Sabrina Wheeler, has published this paper, Housing as a Human Right, a policy paper. He is, a tenant organizer and works with groups that study land use issues, and has been doing this for a long time. And the reality is that housing and the safety and security of housing should be something that we protect, in the same way that healthcare is important to protect, because healthcare is something that we know is crucially important to our overall societal health. Housing is equally important. And we've seen the ability and the importance of providing housing for low-income residents. We've seen the importance and the value of doing these things, that giving people homes is much less expensive than dealing with the needs when they don't have homes. Whether that is someone who is dealing with more health problems, dealing with more limitations in access and ability to get a job, whether it's any of these things, the reality is that giving people homes is very valuable. Valuable to us. Valuable to the people who pay taxes, because your tax money will otherwise go to providing services, more expensive services, to people who need those homes. So rent control for the 21st century, what would it look like? Well, we've seen in Oregon and California is specific rates tied to a fixed in annual increase cap plus inflation, so 5% or 7% plus inflation, which means that your rent could go up to 10% a year, but you could never have one of those 45% increases in 1 year. Now, this doesn't keep people from displacement all on its own. Absolutely not. Because if your rent goes up by 10% every year, you are still going to be priced out, right? Or if it goes up by 7% every year, if it goes up by 3% every year, you're still going to be priced out. And so you still have to have some way to hold market rents in check. You still have to find some way to drive down the overall prices so that you don't have people who are losing their homes, which under a rent control regime like proposed in Oregon and California will happen. But one of the things that can happen when you have these slower rent increases is that you can adapt, right? You can say, okay, like I need to, get it, like yes, my rent went up by 10% this year, but it didn't go up by 25% and I had to leave my unit right away. It didn't go up all at once. And so it went up by 10% this year and it might go up by another 5% next year. And so I need to figure out how to deal with that, whether that is I get a roommate or whether that is I get a second job, unfortunately, because right now it is not affordable in any city in the country to be able to pay rent for a 1-bedroom apartment or 2-bedroom apartment and 2-bedroom apartment on a minimum wage job. Full-time minimum wage job can't pay for your rent anywhere in the country. You have to do something more than that. But at least if your rent is going up more slowly, you have that time to adapt and adjust. And it also prevents the problem of landlords who don't want to do anything because they're not getting any increased money, they can't pay their property taxes, or other things like that, which we do see from lower end rental units in Boston, which is what leads in some cases to them being flipped to investors who then evict all the tenants and redevelop them. So rent control is about providing that level of stability, providing that increased level of access, and being aware that, okay, yes, I might have to deal with something, but I'm not going to have to deal with everything all at once. We also need to end exclusionary zoning. In many cases, especially in Boston, what you will see is that the real source of housing shortage and the real source of unaffordability stems from the fact that there are hundreds or thousands of acres of only single-family homes. And when you have only single-family homes in a city that wants to be as dense as Boston, that drives up costs. Now, I'm not saying we bulldoze all the homes, but what I'm saying is that get rid of the zoning that says that you can only build single-family homes in a place. And what we've seen again and again and again is that many of those single-family home areas, they've priced out more moderate apartments or double-deckers or triple-deckers. They've priced out in the process of that minority communities. In many cases, these rules were initially designed to prevent minority communities from gaining access, and so we need to end those exclusionary zoning rules. We need to bring in the idea of just cause eviction, the idea that you can't be evicted just because your landlord doesn't like you. In the same way that you can't be evicted right now legally for organizing a tenants union. That's something that is protected under Massachusetts law. Your landlord cannot throw you out because you're organizing a tenants union. And your landlord can't throw you out because you're a woman or because you're gay or because you're these other things. And we need to add that protection just in general. Sure, if you are punching holes in the walls, if you are violating the terms of the lease, yes, you should be able to be evicted. But if you're not, then your landlord just deciding, oh, I want you gone, is problematic. So we need to fix that. We need to bring in a tenant opportunity purchase. We need to bring in tenant counsel, because what we see is that in cases, and almost all landlords have counsel when they're going through eviction proceedings, but what we find is that many tenants do not, and when tenants do have lawyers representing them, they're 75% less likely to be evicted, because the reality is that many evictions are illegal. And many tenants are not able to take advantage of legal protections that are available to them. And even if they are in a situation where they're going to be evicted, in many cases, the landlord is going to owe them money in some way, whether it's security deposit or getting other fees like that back, that tenants should know and have access to, because it makes finding that next home just that little bit easier. Overall, we need to better protect tenants. We just do. We need to better protect tenants in all kinds of ways. And rent control, in a period of transition, which is what we are in right now, we need to find ways to deal with the crisis that we have on our hands. We need to stop the massive amount of displacement that we're seeing, especially in very low-income communities and very low-income housing. And we need to find ways to deal with these issues. And rent control is one tool to do that. But we also need to make sure that we're not going to put a stop to all new housing, because putting a stop to all new housing isn't good either. And we need to be aware that housing built at just about any point on the spectrum is going to help in the big picture. Not help everybody, because no individual housing unit is going to help everybody, but it will help to keep more people housed. It will help to keep more people in homes, even if we build only expensive yuppie fish tanks. It does. But none of that is going to have the immediate impact of protecting people who are at the lowest incomes. None of that is going to have the impact of doing enough to protect people who are going to be displaced this month or this year or in the next 5 years, because we're going to continue to be in this housing shortage, because we have left ourselves, after 75 years of lack of building, after demolishing massive amounts of units in slum clearing and urban renewal projects, after doing so much to leave housing issues unaddressed as the result of shrinking populations, of white flight, of post-industrial, wastelands in many parts of the Boston area. As we now see this demand back up, and we have failed to ramp up to meet that demand, we need to do better. In Cambridge, since 2013, we've added 25,000 jobs, according to state data. We've added only 3,000 homes, according to data from HUD. That's not enough. If we're adding 25,000 people who work in Cambridge, then in order to make people able to live here and afford to live here, we have to add a lot more homes. We have to figure out how to do that. And we need to figure out how to add homes that are not just expensive. We need to figure out how to add new units in existing buildings so that we can have lower cost units. We need to figure out how to add affordable housing and public housing. We need to figure out how to add units that are available at every level of the price range so that we can keep people in homes. We need to do that. And we need to do that in Cambridge and in Boston, and we need to do that in Brookline and in Belmont and in Arlington and in Somerville and in every city in the freaking Boston metro area. Because right now, it doesn't matter how far you go, housing is expensive everywhere. The best thing you can do at the moment in order to find somewhat affordable housing is to move to Providence and commit to taking the commuter rail every day. And sadly, when you get on the commuter rail, you add another $400 a month to your annual passes of getting back and forth to the city if this is where you work. And so suddenly your housing doesn't seem so affordable anymore when your transportation costs are added, and suddenly you lose access to these things. City Council elections next week, and I'm supporting a slate of candidates, including Jeevan Sabrina Wheeler, a Better Cambridge Action Fund's slate of candidates, support finding ways to build more housing, but especially affordable housing, especially funding more affordable housing, especially finding ways to build units inside of the existing structures that we have, especially finding ways to commit resources and funds and bonds and everything else we need in order to build more homes. And yes, we also support tenant protections like just cause eviction, like right of first refusal, like rent control. Better Cambridge was one of the sponsors of yesterday's action at the State House, and I think that these tools are important in order for cities and towns and populations to protect themselves from the ongoing crisis. But we have to realize that just putting a cap on price isn't the end-all be-all solution to anything, because if you just put a cap on price, you have two options. You're either locking people out permanently, or you're just eventually going to face more displacement. We got to do it all. We got to say yes and, yes and, yes and to rent control and tenant protections and building luxury units and building mid-range units and building low-income units and everything in between and above and beyond. I'm Chris Schmidt. This is Renters Matter. Vote next week, November 6th, 5th.